So welcome everyone to an online presentation from Wisteria Hearst. It's been a while. My name's Penny Martorell, and I'd like to introduce my colleague, the Wisteria Hearst Director, Megan Seiler. Megan, you want to wave? We'll be working together to address any technical issues that come up during the presentation. And that said, if you have any technical issues like you can't hear or we're not seeing your questions, feel free to leave a chat message and we'll try to address it off screen. The format will be a short introduction. The presenter will present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up to everyone for question and answer. Tonight's presentation is being recorded, and we will make it available on our YouTube channel for a period of time. I'd like to take a minute to thank the Massachusetts State Historical Records Advisory Board Veterans Heritage Preservation Grant, who has made this evening's event possible, and also the Holyoke Local Cultural Council for assisting in sponsoring the exhibit, and to Fort Ticonderoga, who is providing tonight's speaker. Our current exhibit in our gallery is entitled Attention, Translating Uniforms, Understanding Service, and it's a display of military uniforms from various branches of the military, men's and women's uniforms, and from different eras, all the way from the Civil War to most recently Afghanistan. Our guest curator, Nick Anderson from the UMass Amherst Public History Program, has done a wonderful job of teaching civilians how to read a uniform and appreciate the service of soldiers who wore them. I know I've come to a much better understanding of what service to one's country means, just by learning about the different aspects of the uniforms. So how did we get here? What's the idea behind wearing a uniform, and how did these ideas develop from the beginnings of our country? This journey was not straightforward and was impacted by America's political and cultural diversity, the fortunes of war, and the struggling economy of a young nation. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Matthew Keagle, curator of the Fort Ticonderoga Museum, one of North America's largest collections of early modern military material culture. What did you say, Matt? Over 20,000 pieces of...
Oh, probably closer to 200,000.
Oh, 200,000. Excuse me. Yeah, that's a lot. Dr. Keagle has been involved in curation, exhibitions, research, historical interpretation, and program development for historic sites and museums in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Delaware, Virginia, North and South Carolina. He holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell University, a master's in American material culture from Winterthur Museum, and a PhD from the Bard Graduate Center in New York City. Since joining Fort Ticonderoga in 2014, he has been involved in developing exhibits, conducting research, delivering programs, and advancing our understanding of how the 18th century military experience, advancing our understanding of the 18th century military experience. Excuse me. He has researched and lectured at archives and collections across the US, Canada, and Europe, with a particular research focus on military dress in the 18th century. Please help me welcome Dr. Matthew Keagle.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight, and to the organization for having me. I'm excited to see the exhibit when I get the chance to get down to your neck of the woods. I was really excited to come and talk to you all. I think to provide a little of the background to your exhibition, which, as you say, begins around the Civil War, because the period that I focus on and that I study primarily is kind of just up to that time period. And it's really around the origin of the United States during our War of Independence. And I think that military uniforms in particular are such a fascinating object not only because they're visually quite compelling, but they actually reveal a lot about the societies that create them, I think. And so it's my hope tonight to be able to lay out some of the background into how the United States developed into the uniforms that you see around the time that your exhibit begins. So with that being said, I'm going to share my presentation here. And hopefully everyone can see the slides all right. I'll be moving through a number of images here from our collection at Fort Ticonderoga, as well as some others that I think illustrate these points. And I want to start with an image that's in our collection here. This is by an American illustrator named Henry Ogden, who was active in the late 19th and the early 20th century. And this is a rather idealized image, but it's one of the visions I think we have of the Continental Army, the army that achieved American independence during the Revolutionary War. And I say that this is one of the visions that we have because the other side is an army entirely bereft of uniforms. You know, these are the ragged Continentals leaving bloody footprints in the snow as they march to Valley Forge and what have you. And the reality of the experience of the Continental Army and of the early United States with military uniforms is actually somewhere in between these two extremes. And that can be hard to recover because frankly, it's quite complicated. And I hope to at least scratch the surface of this with you all tonight and get us from the colonial period into the early 19th century. Now, prior to the American Revolution, of course, there was no United States as we know it today. The British colonies on the Atlantic seaboard were a selection of disparate entities, and there was no army for all of them. There were, by the middle of the 18th century, scattered numbers of British regular soldiers in America, but not many at all. And rather, the means of defense or military capability in British America was something that fell onto the colonial militias. Now, this changed somewhat during the great conflicts with New France, culminating in the middle of the 18th century in the 1750s with what we know in the United States mostly as the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. And what is interesting about this experience is that Americans came into this conflict with the British Army as allies. They went into this together. But America did not have the means of raising soldiers. They could mobilize their militia, but to mobilize one's militia was to basically send off the productive adult male population of a community and risk them being damaged or annihilated even in action. And Americans didn't seem typically eager to go out into the field for long periods of time, and it was expensive to do so. So to wage the increasingly large and long distance campaigns that the British wanted to wage against the French to ultimately subdue New France required raising soldiers that were somewhere in between the redcoats, the regular soldiers of the British Army, which Americans weren't keen on enlisting in, and the militias that acted more locally and were very costly to call out in large numbers for larger operations. These troops became known as provincial soldiers. And so rather than answering a muster, they enlisted, but they enlisted for short periods of time with usually a single destination or a campaign in mind for a term of maybe 8 or 9 or 10 months. So not even an entire year in many cases. And of course, these soldiers going into the field required clothing to keep them warm and healthy, but they also needed uniforms to be able to identify them. And what we see, if we go up and down the East Coast and look at how Americans dealt with this, is something like the images that we see here, some of the very few portraits that survive from the 7 Years' War in America, where every colony basically came up with its own means of uniforming its soldiers that they were sending into provincial service. Some colonies would simply pay soldiers a bounty to bring clothing from home, provided that it maybe matched a certain set of colors. Other colonies, like Virginia, actually purchased ready-made uniforms from London and issued them out to their soldiers. But what we see is a diverse range of colors and styles varying as the different colonies varied. Even right here, we see a soldier from Connecticut wearing a red coat that we know some of them did, again, not uncommon being a British colony. Others chose a blue coat, which is something that even some volunteer troops in Britain did. So the replication of traditional British styles, but a lot of different vocabularies as far as their color. There was no single colonial uniform at this time period. And this was true even outside of the provincial service. These provincial troops helped Britain win the French and Indian War to drive out the French from Canada. And both before and after this, these were augmented not only by the regular colonial militias, but by volunteer companies. These were voluntary groupings of citizens who decided, issued a charter, typically from the king, to operate as such, that they would train more often, they would design their own uniforms, they would buy their own clothing and equipment. And this example right here is actually a uniform from one of those companies that's in our collection at Fort Ticonderoga, and represents what, based on my research, I believe to be the oldest surviving American-made military uniform in existence. And I can say with some confidence that this was made and worn between April of 1772 and August of 1774, just before the American Revolution. And it might be striking to us to think about an American military company wearing a red coat, given what we know about the later Revolutionary War. But of course, in 1772, we were British subjects. And the rights, even that antagonistic Americans were agitating for in these colonies, were their rights as English subjects. In fact, this company was a company out of Boston, commanded by none other than John Hancock. And so you can see some of the deep connections that Americans had with the British experience, even as they began to wage war against British subjects. And in fact, I could talk this whole time just about this coat and its background, but suffice it to say that this company actually voluntarily disbanded themselves because they felt that the governor of Massachusetts abrogated the charter that had been given to them by King George II in 1741. So despite having this red coat, showing this unity with British government and this attachment to British forms and systems, they still were antagonistic to the arbitrary military authority that was being pressed upon them within the colony. Now, as we all know, this breaks out into open war on April 19th of 1775, and various types of soldiers drawn from the militia and other temporary organizations begin to coalesce outside of Boston, and we see the beginning of our war for independence. And it's not long after this, it's in June of 1775 that the Continental Army is created, nominally the Army of Congress, and maybe the army of this new American nation, although that's still not entirely clear. What is clear is that uniforms have a value in this army. Many of these soldiers go to war wearing their civilian clothing, but it becomes evident to many Americans up and down the East Coast that uniforms are important, not just to keep men warm and healthy in the field and protected from the elements, not only to identify friends from enemies, not only to identify different branches of service, infantry, cavalry, artillery from one another, but more importantly, to foster esprit de corps, to foster a sense of belonging of these soldiers, and to create an identity, and perhaps an identity as an American army. And this impulse runs headlong against the fact that the Continental Army consists of soldiers drawn from, at the very least, 13 separate colonies with vastly different cultures and peoples and populations. And they initially find very little unity in their ability to create a uniform for this army. I think we see a good example of this in a series of buttons that were recovered from the site of Fort Ticonderoga, which was captured by American forces less than a month after the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And these buttons primarily date from 1776, so the first full year of the war, but even before independence has been declared. And what you'll notice is these represent at least 4 different states or 4 different colonies worth of uniforms, and yet there is no single organizing structure to them. The 3 buttons on the left are all from Pennsylvania, and you may be able to make out a number and BP, which stands for Battalion of Pennsylvania. So there is a state affiliation here. Next to that is a button that says, and you may be able to faintly make out some of this, New Jersey. So New Jersey troops are wearing the name of their colony on their buttons, not Continental Army. And then the other buttons on the side, there's a 7, an 8, and there's a handmade kind of scratched in 14. And these all represent the first attempt of George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and the Continental Congress to create a sense of unity, to effectively do what the British Army did, which is where you have a national army. They all wear the same uniform, and there's slight variations, maybe the color of the collar and the lapels and the cuffs of their uniform, and their buttons, which bear a numeric number on it, referring to the precedence of that regiment in the line. And Congress in 1776 says, let's do this. Let's create a national army. We'll just number it from 1 to about 26 or so. And there'll be various states represented, but they'll go by the name of that number. And that's what these buttons represent. And that included actually troops from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, even one from Pennsylvania. And yet it didn't encompass the entire Continental Army, because as you can see, these New Jersey and Pennsylvania buttons were made at the exact same time. And they had no part in that numeric structure, that nice ordered system. They went their own way, organized at the level of that state. And I think that these reveal, to a certain extent, the disunity and the kind of parochialism of much of the Revolutionary War. Congress is nominally a national body, but they manage an army that's drawn from all of these different entities. And that makes choosing a uniform hard. Some of the first efforts by the Continental Congress in 1776 determined that they would have a brown uniform coat. So that is, the body of the coat would be brown, and that, like the British Army, the collar, the lapels, and the cuffs, which are collectively called the facings in English, would be different colors with different buttons to identify the different regiments. Now, this sounds great on paper. And in some sense, brown as a uniform choice was kind of a concession to one of the other challenges that Americans faced, which was simply the economy of British North America. Because fabric represents the largest import to the British American colonies prior to the Revolutionary War, both in terms of volume and value of any commodities that are coming into these colonies. And so in April of 1775, America effectively declared war on its fabric store, which makes it challenging to find the uniform materials you need to make clothing for the army. And brown, being something that potentially could be homemade, simple woolens, maybe fit the bill of something that would be not only easier to get, but in some way, I think there is a sense that brown also reflected a certain sense of the American character, in that brown uniforms, which are not common in Europe, are walking a line. Brown is something, it's a color that we see even in the time period associated with tradesmen and farmers. And so this is on the edge of a military uniform, but also the natural virtue of the American citizen, who is a farmer, who is a tradesman and not a soldier, is reflected in this. So in some ways, brown as a color choice was a smart kind of cultural and political and economic move on the part of the American military. There's just one problem we find, is not all Americans liked brown as a color. And it was hard to get. Even then, finding enough brown cloth was challenging. And so very early on in the Revolutionary War, troops, not just from separate colonies, but even in different regiments within colonies, often find themselves wearing uniforms in a rainbow of colors. I've got a slide here that depicts just a handful of uniforms from Continental officers and soldiers that survived from about the first half of the Revolutionary War. And we can see white, blue, gray, a color called drab, which is kind of a drab, brownish gray color. We can see green. Almost every color in the rainbow is represented in one uniform or another within the Continental Army, simply because the economics were such that you couldn't find that much cloth in a single color. And it got so bad that Washington actually laments this repeatedly, saying by the time his army's at Valley Forge, we're going to go into the field in a rainbow of colors the next campaign, because we simply can't get this. And because so many men prefer colors like blue and red, they're pushing up the price of them on the market so others can't get them. And this is a real issue for the Continental Army, because what they're creating is maybe individual regiments are fully uniformed, but there is no overarching program to these things. There's no unity to this army. It reflects the diversity that Washington and others are trying to kind of rein in within the Continental Army. Again, as a factor largely of economics as much as anything else. And this is something that will plague the Continental Army throughout the Revolutionary War, and actually much later than that even. And there are ways that Washington and others try to mitigate the challenges that they face. In fact, there was one of those in an image I just showed you. There's this wonderful German engraving, which is actually just at the end of the Revolutionary War. It was published as a nice soldier in a brown uniform. And next to him is a soldier wearing this kind of loose, odd-looking garment, which is really Washington's answer to create a cheap and effective national uniform. And he recommends this as early as 1775 outside of Boston, where he sees that his army has no uniforms. They have no means of identifying themselves as a single national army, and the men's clothes are wearing out. And he suggests something that he knew from his experience in the frontiers of Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia that was known as a hunting shirt or a hunting frock. New Englanders, like us, tend to call it a rifle frock because it's associated with riflemen from the West. And effectively, it's just a linen shirt, not that different from the shirt any men or soldiers would be wearing underneath all this clothing, but it's open in the front, so you can pull it over like a coat, and it has a little cape over the shoulders, and it's often covered with fringe around the edges. And this garment is uniquely American. As I say, it comes from the experience of Americans pushing westward, their influences of European clothing, their elements, most likely of Native American clothing, and it becomes something that is truly American. And Washington says, not only is this great because it is in some ways a national garment, it's associated with our rifle troops. So maybe the British will be afraid if all our guys start wearing this, that we're all marksmen. And spoiler alert, the British don't see that for very long. They realize pretty quickly that not all Americans are crack shots. Nevertheless, this also has the advantage of not being made of heavy woolens, which Americans have trouble importing, but linen, which can be domestically produced. It can be cheaply produced. In the summer, you can just wear this thing over your shirt or your waistcoat, and it's nice and cool. In the winter, you can layer other clothes underneath it. And so no matter what you can get your hands on, you still look uniform. And so Washington really promotes this around the Continental Army as a solution to the uniform problems they face. And over the course of the Revolutionary War, the hunting shirt becomes, in a sense, the de facto uniform of the Continental Army. Now, the only problem with this in some ways is that because it is so truly American, it failed in one of the things that uniforms have to do, which is uniforms only work if both you and your enemies wear them, because it's a kind of international sartorial language, but everyone has to participate for them to work. And if they don't, you don't get one of the key benefits of wearing uniforms, which is legitimacy. And this is a hugely important point for the Continental Army because they want to be seen as a nation, not just by their enemies, the British, but by potential allies like the French. And uniforms are an incredibly powerful expression of legitimacy because it means that you have mobilized your population to create garments. You have an economic system that can get the materials together, can manufacture things in large quantities. And ideally, if there's a single national uniform, the army is then kind of a microcosm, a reflection of the state at large. And when you have a uniform that Europeans don't understand, you have a hard time doing that. And so the other engraving here is one that was published in Germany during the Revolutionary War, based on eyewitness descriptions of German officers seeing Americans. And you can see, these guys look pretty wild with their beards and their fringe and their bare feet. And you can see, if this is a game of telephone from the 18th century, this is a few bits removed from what they were seeing, but this is how Europeans were looking at Americans. And they're not looking at them like another European army. This is more like an ethnographic plate of, South Seas Islanders than it is of an equal national entity. And that was a problem for Americans. But the economic realities of the war meant that these garments, these hunting shirts, became used regularly year to year, especially during the summer seasons, when they could save American soldiers winter uniforms for the cold weather when it was needed. And so you see images like this, which is one of the most kind of compelling images of a Continental Army from the Revolutionary War from a French observer, where we see a mixture of troops, both wearing proper uniforms and wearing variations of these hunting shirts, as they would have seen. But again, you sense the kind of motley character. Every different regiment has its own way of being represented and of representing itself. The ability to present the American nation as a singular thing is somewhat lacking in this world. Now, this changes somewhat, at least theoretically, midway through the Revolutionary War. And that is in 1779, Congress issues a regulation to come up with a new uniform for the Continental Army. And this uniform order, again, tries to intellectually deconstruct America, create a single national uniform that will be blue, a blue coat. Again, this isn't a departure from traditional practices going back to the colonial period. I showed you some earlier. A blue coat is something that colonials wore. It's something familiar to British subjects. You know, they're not wearing the white uniform of the French army in this case. And what they would do then is subdivide the young United States into 4 parts, basically New England, the New York, New Jersey part of the upper mid-Atlantic, the lower mid-Atlantic, and the American South. And each one of those regions' troops would have a different color for the collar, the lapels, and the cuffs of their uniform. So New Englanders, like this copy of a 18th century image of a Rhode Island soldier, would have white facings on their blue uniforms. Soldiers from the mid-Atlantic, so Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, would have red facings, like the portrait miniature you see here. Those from New York, New Jersey, would have buff, kind of a straw color to their facings. And from the lower South, the Carolinas and Georgia, with a kind of a lace edging around them. And in theory, this created a truly national uniform for the Continental Army. Once again, though, the economic realities of the Revolutionary War meant that this wasn't always possible to achieve. And in various instances, we see soldiers simply unable to get the uniforms that were laid down on paper by Congress. And as I noted before, in the summers, often making do with those linen hunting shirts rather than any woolen uniforms. Now, by the time we get to the end of the Revolutionary War, 1782, 1783, around the time images like this was done, which is an eyewitness view of the fortifications at West Point, and you might be able to make out the soldiers there wearing those blue coats with, in this case, red facings, red collar and cuffs and lapels. And Washington issued orders at the very tail end of the war that for the future, the blue coat, the red facings would be the national uniform of the Continental Army. And at the very tail end of the Revolutionary War, we almost got there. We got about as close as we did to a truly national uniform throughout this entire conflict. But it was due in no small part to the French and Dutch and Spanish alliances, or at least declarations of war, that allowed European materials once again to come into America. In fact, there are situations where the French came in and officials, American officials, were able to order tens of thousands of uniforms manufactured in France for the Continental Army. Now, uniforms wear out. They're not expected to last more than a year, really, in the Continental Service. And so constantly, every year, you face the challenge of getting new uniforms. And the Army's ability to get something like uniformity in those last years of the war was due, in many cases, just due to the small size of the Army. In some cases, a tenth of what it had been in the largest campaigns of the Revolution, in 1776, for instance. And so only those small numbers enabled it to achieve something like the uniformity that congressional officials, Washington and other officers had desired earlier in that conflict. And even then, even at the very end of the war, they're finding that they can't find enough red in some cases to trim out the uniforms the way they would like to. And this is the way that the Continental Army ends their Revolutionary War. In fact, right at the tail end of the Revolutionary War, the American Army was still doing something that they had started doing earlier in the war, which was wearing captured British uniforms. It's hard for us to imagine, but over the Revolutionary War, my estimate is that maybe 10 or 12,000 British uniforms were worn by Continental soldiers, simply because the need for clothing was so great. And the vast majority of those were worn as red as the day they were made. In fact, there are accounts of battles where they talk about our redcoats going up against their redcoats. And so by capturing uniforms, not only did you keep those out of the enemy's hands, but it gave your men something, even if it potentially provides problematic situations on the battlefield or elsewhere. By the end of the Revolutionary War, though, fortunately, many of the captured uniforms that were coming in were being able to be taken apart and over-dyed. So dyeing that red a brownish color, which maybe isn't ideal, but at least keeps your men fully uniformed. But the tiny Continental Army that ends the Revolutionary War largely ends it wearing these blue uniforms trimmed with red, which I think still in our minds is something we think about as a Continental uniform. And in no small part, that's because this uniform survives the Revolutionary War. Now, the Continental Army is disbanded at the end of the Revolution. And in fact, there's almost no continuity beyond a few dozen artillerymen between the Continental Army that won the Revolutionary War and the United States military that is created afterwards. Congress has tight controls over that army, especially early on in the 1780s, as they're both afraid of the possibility of having a national army that could potentially suppress civil government, but also simply economically, financially. The new nation is only staggering to its feet. And so the tiny American military that acts to defend the United States' coasts, as well as expand westward and fight Native American nations who bitterly resist the encroachment of American forces and settlers, is an army that wears a uniform similar to that the Continental Army ended the Revolution in. That is, that blue coat trimmed with red, some various different trimmings, whether these are infantry or cavalry or artillery, but again, perpetuating this scheme from the Revolution, and in some ways perpetuating maybe a less radical strain of American independence than they could have had they gone to those brown uniforms that they wore early on. Because these blue uniforms turned up with red, frankly, are pretty conservative in their cut and their trimmings after the Revolutionary War. In fact, when you compare these, for instance, to volunteer uniforms being worn in England in the 1790s, they're very similar. And I think it shows the cultural connections that still persisted between Britain and America. We're part of a shared Anglophone culture. And so we still do things rather like the English in many ways. Nevertheless, this becomes the uniform of the American military after the Revolution and into our early national period. I can illustrate this into the early 19th century by some uniforms in our museum's collection here at Fort Ticonderoga. Now, these are all uniforms, and I'll get into this a little bit later, from the militias of various states, but they reflect by and large the evolution of regular army uniforms at this time from that, again, blue faced with red uniform. We see the style evolve from the Revolutionary War era with that kind of cutaway front to one that buttons all the way to the waist tightly with a tall collar to it, which becomes fashionable in the early 19th century. And then the biggest challenge that the United States faces in some regards is continued antagonism, though, with Great Britain. This culminates, of course, in the War of 1812, which is perhaps the greatest threat to the early United States. And it's why some people still refer to this as the Second War of Independence. And Americans find during this period that they face some of the exact same stresses they faced during the Revolutionary War. Despite being an independent nation, the United States was still building up itself, building up its economy, its ability to manufacture goods. Even into the late 1790s, Alexander Hamilton, who is involved expanding the US Army to fight a potential war with France, is still importing cloth for US Army uniforms from Great Britain. Americans cannot manufacture enough materials of the right quality to outfit their own army. And when the War of 1812 begins, they face this in deep earnest because they are now again fighting the British. And so the early War of 1812 sees the US Army, which expands enormously, almost overnight, as we go to war with Great Britain, facing some of those exact same challenges that we saw during the Revolutionary War of not having the materials we need to make proper uniforms. And once again, American soldiers, now this time part of the United States Army rather than the Continental Army, go to war wearing uniforms of gray and green and brown and drab and all of these different colors that are not ideal. And they're certainly not the national blue that we have come to expect by this point in time, but they simply are available and meet the need to get these soldiers into uniforms. And so the center uniform that you see here is one from a Maine soldier. And that uniform was probably intended to be blue, and yet the material it's made out of is actually black cloth. I think simply substituted because they found black cloth when blue was unavailable, when we know blue was scarce on the ground. Even though the War of 1812 is not a lengthy conflict, it lasts long enough that there are substantial changes made to American military uniforms during the war. One of which is, as we start to get at least a more stable supply of blue cloth, they do away with the red trimming that had been in effect since the Revolutionary War. And so by early 1813, American uniforms completely omit those red facings. And they become, like that one you see at the far right of this slide, entirely blue. This is a somber, dare I say, Republican uniform, kind of befitting in some way the American state, which is not an ostentatious one. Remember, this is the Napoleonic era in Europe, which is kind of the height of excess in military uniforms from the kind of the broader early modern period. And Americans have devised a simple, modest, effective uniform that I think allowed them in some ways to weather the economic issues they were facing with their army and still represent the nation. And it is this uniform, this kind of simple blue uniform, that sees the American military through the end of the War of 1812 and into the period after that, into the 1810s and 20s, the era of good feelings. And if this kind of solid blue is familiar, it is this solid blue uniform that comes out of the War of 1812 period that becomes the standard for the United States Army for almost the rest of its existence, still to the dress blue service uniforms of today's United States military. They owe their origin in no small part to the early 19th century and the solidification of this all blue uniform in the wake of the War of 1812. But that's only part of the story, because the American military in the late 18th and the early 19th centuries isn't just the United States Army. In fact, the United States Army is the smallest portion of the military of the United States. The vast majority of the military forces of this country were in the militia. Now, this is a satirical image of an American militia muster from the late 1810s, but the militia, that is the armed citizenry, obligated, at least free white men of a certain age, obligated to turn out at certain times of the year and maintain themselves with a bare minimum of military equipment, was deemed to be, by many Americans, a better defense for a free Republican state than a standing army. Americans having inherited a political tradition from Great Britain that was very wary of the ability of a powerful army to overthrow civil government. Going back to the Romans through the 17th century and the experience of the British Civil Wars and Oliver Cromwell and the dissolution of Parliament, to the arbitrary authority that they felt George III threw upon them with his army in America. And so many Americans were very wary about an army and kept it, kind of on a short leash, feeling that the better defense for the country was the militia, was the people themselves, who would be inculcated with a Republican virtue for having done this. And the militia on paper was enormous, millions of men strong across the country, even though the terms of the militia meant that it was an absolute minority of the population. By the War of 1812, it's estimated that maybe 10% of the American population participated in the militia, which, when you compare it to today, when less than 1% of the American population is enrolled in the US Armed Forces of any branch, is a remarkably high proportion of our country. Now, the militia, by and large, the enrolled or standing companies, didn't wear uniforms. And you can see in this image, again, although it's a parody, these men are simply wearing their civilian clothing. They're carrying muskets, they have equipment maybe, but there's no overarching program to their uniforms. Their officers might wear them, of course, generally following the patterns of the US Army, but the bulk of them did not. However, like in the colonial period with that early militia uniform I showed you, there is a volunteer militia that exists in the late 18th and early 19th century. Again, men who form companies on their own, who go to their own efforts to train and drill more than the obligatory terms, that design and purchase their own uniforms and equipment. And I think it's worth thinking about them as we understand American military uniforms, because they show us a different side of the American character and American identity in this time period. Now, I'm going to use a few examples from our collection here. This is a wonderful collection, not from Fort Ticonderoga, the Metropolitan Museum, that shows the volunteer militia of Philadelphia. And you can see there's a whole range of different styles. With each company able to choose their own uniforms, you see an incredible explosion of kind of color and style based on the preferences of these individuals and the models that they choose to follow. And you see that visually here, but we can also see it in actual objects. Now, many American militias, like these uniforms in our collection here at Fort Ticonderoga, simply aped or followed the model of the regular Army. A blue uniform, hats similar to the Army, white waistcoats, white breeches like the regulars. And we can see that, this little coat here. I showed the back view because the little edged effect on the skirts and the pocket flaps just is really striking, I think. But it's very similar to what the regular Army would have been wearing in the late 18th century. Now, there are some variations. Some states chose to have blue coats, but maybe different colors to their facings. This is a white-faced uniform from Massachusetts. We know that states like New York mandated blue faced with white for the officers' uniforms, even within their enrolled militia. And so things mimicking that of the regular Army were common, but they were not the only uniforms that were available. We don't have to look far to find uniforms, again, in a range of different colors. Again, not based necessarily on economics as they were for the armies of the Revolution or the War of 1812, but based on choice. And these express different identities of people across the American states. From these simple white uniforms, we know there are some militia companies in Massachusetts that chose white specifically as a testament to the French troops that allied with the Americans during the Revolutionary War. Green uniforms like this striking coat in our collection from Troy, New York, from a rifle company called the Trojan Greens. Chose green, as many rifle and light infantry companies did, because of its associations with these light troops, marksmen with some amount of concealment maybe, but these colors were associated with these troops working at the flanks, the sharpshooters of the army. And so those colors are common. And remarkable as it might sound to us today, red was by no means an uncommon color for American militias in the late 18th and the early 19th century. Even in the wake of the Revolutionary War, as this wonderful picture shows, this depicts the soldier of the Boston Independent Fusiliers, a company that maybe importantly was raised during Shays' Rebellion in the mid-1780s from Boston citizens who were eager to see this rebellion kind of be nipped in the bud. Maybe somewhat pointedly chose a red coat as something that expressed authority and control. They clearly were not uncommon in early America, and we have extant examples of them. We have a number of them in our collection here at Fort Ticonderoga. They seem to be quite common, especially for cavalry, probably no doubt as a way of further distinguishing themselves from soldiers on foot, from the infantry or the artillery. Because, of course, the cavalry in the 18th and the early 19th centuries came with a higher sense of social standing, because not only did you have to provide your own uniforms and weapons, you had to have a horse and provide all the equipment for it, which is an enormous expense at this time period. And so troops of cavalry were typically from among the more socially able men, or participating in these could potentially raise your social status. These bright red uniforms set them apart once again from the rank and file, even of the militia. And it's not to say they didn't cause challenges every once in a while. There's accounts of the War of 1812 of New York cavalrymen from the militia in red uniforms being mistaken for British soldiers and being fired on by other Americans. Incidentally, the British cavalry in the War of 1812 actually wore blue uniforms, so there could be a bit of confusion in either direction. Nevertheless, I think that these uniforms show us the kind of diversity of American identities at this time period. And if we look at the kind of efflorescence of colors and styles and influences, European fashions, American fashions that the militia shows, it shows us the incredible diversity of this country, even to various ethnic groups, Germans, English, Scottish, later Irish, and even African Americans, using militia uniforms to express their identity, but also their participation within the American state. And these things crawl out of the woodwork all the time. I can't tell you how many times I've been contacted by an historical society or a museum that says, we have a red coat British uniform from the Revolutionary War. And I have to very politely inform them that, in fact, this is probably an American uniform from the militia. But that in its own way, I think, is fascinating because it gives us another glimpse into the possible selves that Americans created in the 18th and the early 19th centuries. Beyond this, though, I want to conclude by kind of looking at one of the most enduring uniforms from this period that reflects, I think, both the personalities and the institutions created during the Revolutionary era, which give Americans some sense of a national identity. And I'm referring here to the uniform of the Commander-in-Chief, of George Washington. Washington, very early on, by 1775, decides on a uniform for the general officers of the Continental Army. A uniform of blue, as we've described, but faced with buff. That is this kind of straw color with gilt buttons, and then a buff waistcoat and breeches to go with it. And this becomes emblematic of George Washington. He consistently wears this uniform throughout the war. Despite the economic value of uniforms like the hunting shirt, Washington's never depicted wearing that. He wears a uniform that is simple, it is modest, again, I dare say Republican even, and expresses in many ways both the legitimacy that uniforms provide without the ostentation that they can take on. And you don't have to look far in history to find various rebel leaders or revolutionaries that wear really elaborate uniforms. And Washington, I think, chose something rather modest as an expression ultimately of his modesty, I think, in some ways, as a leader of this revolution, or at least of this war for independence. And this uniform, blue faced with buff, becomes the standard for general officers in the American military and the militia for decades afterward. Despite the changes of the uniforms of the infantry and the cavalry and the going from red to white to blue facings, general officers continue to wear this uniform almost throughout this entire period. And in fact, we have a couple examples in our collection here at Fort Ticonderoga. In the center, a militia general officer's uniform from about 1808. And then beyond that, one from almost 1840. We're getting right up to the period just before your exhibition begins. And once again, a militia general officer's uniform that admittedly someone has taken a little more effort to embellish, but that still references at its core the uniform that Washington wore through the Revolutionary War, and connects then the militia as well as the regular army to the legacy of the revolution and the visual representation of the American state in some small way that Washington himself began to promulgate. And this uniform really only disappears from US regulations in the decade or so prior to the American Civil War. And so I think that it is interesting to follow this as perhaps the most uniform of the late 18th and the early 19th century, because I think it does express so much the intention, at least, of Washington and the Continental Army to create a nation that thought about itself as a nation, more than just an assemblage of states, but as a nation that brought together the diversity from across the Atlantic seaboard into one national entity. And so I think in some ways it's fitting to end with that particular uniform. And I'll just drop one slide on here to say that if you're interested in seeing any of these uniforms I've showed in person, we actually have many of them on display at Fort Ticonderoga right now. You can take a wonderful road trip up the Connecticut Valley over to the Champlain Valley, and you can follow military uniforms from the 18th century all the way to the modern era if you visit these two institutions. And so I'll end on that note, but I want to thank you again for having me here and allowing me to hopefully provide some kind of narration of how the uniforms of the United States developed by the middle of the 19th century out of the experience of our war for independence.
Wow, that was great, Matt. That was so interesting. Let me just turn on everybody's view here. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions that came up?
I had one.
Please.
Is there, this isn't my area of expertise at all, but were French uniforms, from my art history background, usually blue with like red facing as well? Was there any influence between the two?
So that's a really good question. actually, for the bulk of the 18th century, the French army famously wore white uniforms. That changes during their revolution. And in fact, one of the major changes during the revolution in France was as the conflict developed, ultimately as the monarchy is extinguished, there needs to be a way to visually show that change. The French, like the British and the Americans, had a militia system called La Milice in France, which was actually a hated institution in France. Not because Frenchmen didn't necessarily want to defend their country, but because it was really arbitrary and authoritarian. Men were literally chosen by lot. If you went into the militia, you could be pulled into the regular forces, you could be marched away to another province. Many communities, kind of rural communities, even had, effectively ceremonies for men that got their lots pulled, almost like funerals, because to them, they may never come back. And in fact, these are one of the doléances, the grievances brought to the Estates General that precipitates the French Revolution in 1789. And again, it's not because Frenchmen didn't want to defend their country and their communities. And so during the revolution, they begin to organize, mostly in cities, although not exclusively, an evolution of the Garde Bourgeoise that becomes known as the Garde Nationale. And the Garde Nationale in France, often like the American militia, they get to pick and choose the styles that they use. And many of them, not all of them, but many of them choose a blue uniform, I think consciously as a way to distinguish themselves. That uniform often has red trimming or facings, which again echo the tricolor flag of revolutionary France. And most famously, the Paris National Guard, which was commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought in our revolution, wears this blue uniform with red and white trimming. And this becomes ultimately, as those National Guardsmen are mobilized to serve alongside the regulars to defend France when every nation in Europe goes to war against it, they decide that it will be the blue of the National Guards that will become the new national uniform for France. And that color, again, has survived to the present day in France, kind of a real emblem of the political revolution that occurred there. And there are moments when you see this dip back and forth as the politics change. So there is a period after the restoration of the monarchy, after 1815 in France, where they actually try to reinstate the white uniform of Bourbon, monarchist France. That doesn't last very long because they go back to being a constitutional monarchy and then a republic, and the blue comes back. But again, you can see these political discourses and changes reflected in the uniforms, because of course the uniforms, not only represent the state, but they represent the ability of the state to enact violence against its enemies. So they're a very real and powerful symbol in the world.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
Anyone else have some questions?
So at any time did the French and the English try to make native peoples identify themselves with some kind of uniform so they could tell them apart?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is yes. Not uniforms as such, because native peoples have their own martial culture, and they will not simply be given something and wear it. They are national entities in their own right. But because of that, and because of the complexities of native warfare, there are instances throughout the colonial period and even later when individuals nominally from the same native tribes are on opposing sides of conflicts. And to many Europeans also, they are unable or unwilling to identify between different native peoples, different cultures and nations. So quite often in military campaigns, what we'll see is the native warriors that are going along with a European or a colonial American force will be given some kind of marker to wear, often in the form of a handkerchief or a piece of cloth. I've seen yellow and red described in historic texts, and they'll literally issue out in the orders to an army to say, make it known the Allied Indians in our force will be wearing a red ribbon in their, in their hair or on their arms or something like that to identify them, so that you don't shoot them. And you don't make that mistake. So they very much find that there is a need to identify Native Americans on the battlefield, or at least in military campaigns, but they have to do it in means that are, within something that those native peoples will do. And incidentally, in some ways, that itself is a reflection of what Europeans even did prior to the adoption of uniforms, because uniforms are actually a relatively recent adoption of warfare. They only really come about in the mid to late 17th century. Prior to that, people are wearing armor, and you can wear cloth over that, but there are no uniforms as such. And so soldiers would often wear what are often called field signs. And it could be, again, a ribbon in the hat or on the arm of a certain color that identifies the side you're on. It could be a sprig of, a tree, an oak leaf or an evergreen bough that, in the lack of anything else, at least enables you to tell one side from another. That's a wonderful question, though.
Anyone else?
We have one in the comments that says, any Prussian influence with von Steuben, from Karen Curtis.
Oh, so I have never found a direct Prussian military influence directly through Baron von Steuben himself. And of course, he wasn't the only Prussian officer in the Continental Army. There were others that came in at various times at various different ranks. However, the American military, as well as the British and French militaries in some ways, that fights the War of Independence, broadly were influenced by Prussian styles of clothing after the middle of the 18th century. The Prussian army was a kind of a weird outlier in Europe, in that they wore these tight-fitting, short little coats, even fairly early in the 18th century, unlike the big, full-skirted, heavy-cuffed French uniforms, which were the most common kind of uniforms at the beginning of the 18th century. But after the successes of Frederick II of Prussia, Frederick the Great, as you may know him, during the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, the style of clothing that the Prussians wore, or at least the cut of it, closer fitting in the arms, shorter in the skirts, kind of a slimmer line to it, starts to become very popular. Now, none of these are exact copies of Prussian uniforms, but the overall cut of them owes something to the significance of Prussia as a model of military effectiveness seen by many in the middle of the 18th century. Now, that being said, Benjamin Franklin, who is working for Congress as an official in France, actually gets letters from a business firm in Berlin seeking to unload hundreds of Prussian army uniforms, thinking, oh, the Americans might like these, because I believe because they have a stockpile of them after the end of what's known as the War of the Bavarian Succession, which happens in Germany at the time. Not a war with a lot of battles, but a certain amount of maneuvering and marching between Prussia and Austria. And like any war, you ramp up your production to meet it. When the war ends, you've got stuff left over. And I suspect that these Prussians were trying to make up on some contracts by selling them off to the Americans. Franklin kind of puts them on the side and says, yeah, well, I'll talk to my people in Congress and see what they say. And I don't think he had any intention of doing that. We never get Prussian uniforms shipped over to America the way we get French uniforms that were directly contracted from France. But nevertheless, that's about as close as we got to true Prussian uniforms ever getting here.
I had a question about who is making these uniforms. So you just made mention that some of them coming from France. Were there any companies that you know of? Or
this is part of the challenge that Americans face, is that there aren't companies. There is no infrastructure to do this early in the Revolutionary War. It has to be created. And so Congress ultimately authorizes a clothier general who at least administers, working with, again, not a single central manufactory, but various state legislatures and governments themselves trying to organize the production of clothing however they can within their individual states. And every state often does it differently, which ends up with a whole slew of trouble. So there's a moment where Connecticut decides that they're going to make a bunch of uniforms on their own, and they get one of their officials who they authorize to purchase cloth, and they get all this material, and they manufacture all these uniforms completely in-house, and they dole them out to their troops. But they end up kind of getting slow because there's no industry to do this, and so they don't come out all at one time, and they're guys that are needing clothing. And this is the same time when the Continental Congress has ordered all these uniforms from France. And so in camp, you have these Connecticut guys who are getting drips and drabs of this clothing that was made in Connecticut, much of which they described wasn't particularly well made. And they're looking at the other troops from these other states that are getting these French-made uniforms that are wonderfully made because they're supposed to be manufactured to the quality of the Royal Army in France. And Connecticut officers like Israel Putnam are writing to Washington saying, well, can we get some of those uniforms? And Washington says, you said you didn't want them. You said you were figuring out how to make uniforms in your own state. And he's like, if you absolutely need them, we can give some, but then I expect that when you get the uniforms from Connecticut, you're going to put them back in the general Continental store so that everyone can benefit from them the way you benefited from these. So again, you see these challenges, this push and pull between, if not the federal government by that time, then a central authority and the various states. And, that interplay of federal and state governments is a real central part of the American experience.
Okay, we have one more question that we have time for.
Okay.
Because we're keeping a little past 7 already. But those slender sleeves don't look very practical. Weren't they constricting?
So, there is commentary that the Prussian model of clothing was a little tight. Even more, there is some satirical literature that describes, at least in the British Army, how if you're a colonel and you get your clothing made at the regimental level, if you make everything real tight, you're saving a lot of money on fabric. And in the British Army, if you were contracting for clothing, the colonel had the prerogative to basically, if he paid under the amount authorized to him by Congress for uniforms, he could pocket the balance. So there's an incentive in some ways to literally skim the uniforms down. Now, again, it's satire, and all satire is based in some reality, but not everyone was doing that very clearly. The slimmer uniforms, I think, if anything, they could, of course, be constricting, but the typical descriptions of making military clothing from this time describe it very literally in some cases as tight without constraint. You want to show off the body, but you don't want to do it at the risk of actually being able to move. And you can also think about it in the sense that, that narrower sleeve maybe to the coat, or the narrower body of the coat, around the wearer's body, has certain advantages over early uniforms, which had big, deep cuffs, which always, can get in the way of things. But again, as with any period in history, there is always a part of it that is function, and there is always a part of it that is fashion, and the two are constantly in tension. And authorities and military thinkers and writers and theorists and officers and soldiers were always going back and forth about what the best form is for the uniforms. Should they be more functional? Should they be more fashionable? And we shouldn't look back at the past and say, boy, they had these really outlandish uniforms they couldn't do anything in. Because in some cases, the reason they chose a uniform that looked one way was because it did something that another uniform didn't. It expressed the character of that nation better, or it followed some kind of national cut better, or maybe it was more practical. But it was always a constant interplay rather than just being, well, this is how we've done things forever. Because even back then, they're always reevaluating what they're doing at various times.
So did the costume designer for Hamilton spend any time at Fort Ticonderoga designing those costumes?
Not to my knowledge, although I think, if you look at them, I mean, obviously every stage production, every film takes often a fair amount of liberties with their costuming. If you're like me and you've studied this long enough, you can actually start to see where the costume designers got their ideas, because you say, oh, that looks a lot like the coat in this museum, or I know where that painting is that they base that off of. And of course, they're not historians, and we like it when they work with us. And occasionally we get inquiries from film and theater productions, the more literature that folks like myself put out, which is a good motivation for me to publish more, the better materials that all of these people will have to create their own visions of the past from.
Wonderful.
So Fort Ticonderoga is only three and a half hours from here.
Oh, a wonderful day trip. Take
I'm
the weekend.
thinking a trip might be in order. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Keagle, for sharing. Oh my goodness, your passion, and you can just tell you love this stuff. And really, I learned so much.
Good. Well, I'm so glad to have joined you all, and I can't wait to come down and see your exhibit. And I hope we'll see some of you up here at Fort Ticonderoga.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And hopefully you'll stop by the museum, where the exhibit is open Mondays and Wednesdays from 10:30 to 12:30, and Tuesday evenings 4:30 to 6:30. And if you have a group, give us a call. We'll make arrangements for you.
Wonderful. And I'll conclude by saying that I'm always happy to entertain any questions anyone might have. You can find my email on Fort Ticonderoga's website under our staff page. Please reach out. It's what we're here for at our museum.
Yeah. Oh, and also this is being recorded, so we will put it up on our YouTube channel. So if you know people who didn't get a chance to see it and might be interested, let them know it's there.
Excellent.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone. Have a good evening.
Have a good night.